um, ended off right there. And so now by looking at core, we had some additional information now that the reservoir was deposited in a high energy environment, because you have these nice thick-walled clamshells and indicating a high energy environment of deposition. So now we have that piece of information, and we also have the piece of information that this log pattern appears to be the one that gives you the reservoir, and this log pattern, even though it's got sand, it's not reservoir for some reason. So that's the information we gathered to date. Now, you put that together, that information, and what it suggests to you mentally is an environment something like this, an environment of deposition where you had a nice high energy surf zone. Here's your surf zone here, and here, that tends to rework the sediment. And I don't know if you've ever walked along one of these high energy beaches. The sand is very clean, porous, permeable, and you often find these thick-walled clamshells and things like that. So the information we got from that discovery well kind of goes along with the reservoir being something like this. That's our kind of our mental image of the reservoir. And also with time, it gives us the idea that with time, our shoreline is migrating landward. And so if you were like standing on the beach right here today, this would be the case. But if you stood there for 1,000 years, with sea level rising, the water depth would go over your head, and you would have finer and finer grained sediment deposited on top of the coarser grained nice beach sand. So that's the image you get, that this big thick sand would be the lower part of a transgressive shoreline sand, and at that one spot, at any one spot like where your well is drilled today, that the water depth would have been increasing with time, so you get finer and finer grained sediment. Okay, so that's the picture that we get. And that would explain why you get that reservoir there, because these are nice reworked high energy sands. So any clays that were originally deposited would be washed away, and from the reservoir sand, it would be nice and clean, laterally continuous, well sorted, good porosity and permeability, and so on. And then it has, with the fining upward, you get the, as sea level rises, you get the finer grained sediment, and this can even, the finer grained sediment on top can even act as a top seal to this reservoir. So we go back now, we apply that to this right-hand picture, our enlargement of the gamma log. And we see now, one of our reservoirs was here. Got kind of that same pattern that you see down here. And the other reservoir was this one up here, which has that same sort of pattern. All the other ones have the opposite pattern, this pattern here. And you see that, cleaning up, cleaning up, cleaning up. Got sand in it, but for some reason, those sands are not productive. And as I'll point out later on, the reason for that is that sands that are deposited during a progradation tend to be lower energy, deposited in a lower energy environment than sands that are deposited during a transgression, where you get the sand in the high energy beach environment. Okay, so that's why you have no reservoir up in these sands. They're sandy, but they also had enough clay in them to plug up the porosity and permeability. So they're not reservoir. So, log patterns so far gives us now a good understanding of the why we have the reservoirs in those two sands and nowhere else in the discovery well. All right, like I said before, you can use fossils, body fossils. Some of them are, we know from studies, when an organism started to evolve and when it became extinct over a period of geological time. Now, engineers, for example, like to think in terms of days, weeks, months, maybe a few years. Geologists, that's anything like that is just an instant in time. Geologists think in terms of thousands, tens of thousands, millions of years, and that's kind of a fundamental difference between engineering and geology. Us geologists look at a longer time interval, whereas an engineer looks at how long it takes to produce a reservoir at that scale. So at any rate, one of the type of analyses that was done on these rocks was looking for these body fossils. And it turned out that there were quite a few body fossils that were deposited in a marine environment. But some of those body fossils were very good indicators of when the organism, a particular organism, started to evolve and when it became extinct. And we often use that date of extinction as an indicator of the time at which the organism lived and then subsequently died. So we call that the extinction age. Now, what you see here is a whole bunch of Latin names, and they are all for different organisms that were found in this interval in one of the cores in the discovery well. 600 to 690 meters in the core, you found all these different types of fossils, all these different types. But one of them was very age diagnostic, indicated a good definitive age, and that was this one here called Broweri. All these fossils have Latin names, and Broweri, we know from other studies in other places that it became extinct 1.95 million years ago. So at that depth in the core, where we found our last Broweri body fossil, we can age date that horizon at 1.95 million years. That it was years ago that it was deposited. Also, we can determine from the body fossils the environment of deposition. And it turns out here what we call, the Broweri lived in what we call the interneritic environment. People who study these fossils are called paleontologists, and they have their own terminology, just like geologists have their own terminology, engineers do, petrophysicists do, so do the paleontologists. And they form a classification of sediments that's based on water depth at which an organism lived. And so there's interneritic stands for water depths kind of, this is a profile of your continental shelf, then your continental slope, and then your basin. The interneritic is water depths, very shallow water. Okay, right about in this zone here, about 0 to 100 feet or 30 meters water depth. So we can use that then. We found that, or we know that Broweri lived in water depths in that range, so we can call the environment of deposition interneritic. The people who did this work went through the whole core looking for these sorts of body fossils, and so at a depth of 700 to 790 meters, they found another one called Globeritalia trunculonides, which is a Latin name for a particular trace fossil or body fossil, and it too lived in these interneritic water depths from about 0 to 100 feet deep. We keep going down in the core, and at 800 meters continue to find Globeritalia trunculonides, and so on. Now all I've shown you here is one page of a paleontology report. And in that report, they've got the fossils that were found throughout the cored well, and also in cuttings, and the environments of deposition. And the environment of deposition all the way down through the core was either interneritic, or sometimes you got a little bit deeper water depth down to outer neritic, which is by definition 600 feet to 300 feet water depth at which an organism lived. So in other words, what this tells you now is that the environment of deposition of the sand bodies was all pretty shallow. Okay, nothing below 600 feet water depth of deposition. And it also gives you some age information. Because again, we get some of these extinction ages. Here, for example, is another one that we found. Globeritalia myoseneca is called. And its extinction age was 2.3 million years. Okay, so now we can use that information and add it to our discovery well log. We know that for example, when this work was done, this was the last appearance. Remember again, the geologists always start at the bottom and they look at things upward. So this was the last appearance at this horizon in the well at which this Globeritalia myoseneca occurred. And we know from studies that it has an extinction age of 2.3 million years. So we can put an age of deposition right here at this depth of 2.3 million years. Reservoir 2, going back to the reservoir, we had a trace body fossil called Globeritalia altospira, and it had an extinction age of 3.1 million years. So down here, we can put an age of 3.1 million years. And then we found further down in the well another organism called the Globeritalia nepenthes, and that had an extinction age of 3.9 million years. So now we've got 3 age dates that we can apply to this discovery well. and the environments of deposition in terms of interneritic or middle neritic or outer neritic. Okay, well, so now, by this time, the guy who had the gray hair is starting to get black again, and he's starting to understand the reservoir. Whereas before, when you just started trying to correlate sand bodies between wells, that was impossible to do without some sort of datums to help you correlate. And here now, we had three datums. We had this Globigerina myoseneca, Globigerina altispira, and Globigerina nepenthes that were intervals or of geological time at which the organism became extinct. So the next step, Pemex came back to us and said, well, that's very good. We now know why only two of the sands are reservoir, because they're high energy deposits that were deposited during a transgression. So they become finer grained up. And all the other ones were deposited during progradation, not transgression. They were deposited during progradation or regression. So that's great. You guys did a great job. Now, the next question is, now that you know why the reservoir is where it is, or the reservoirs are where they are, and how they formed, can you find some more? Remember, the ultimate goal of Pemex in this case was to find more gas fields to take up the from the production decline in Cantarell field. So next step was to try and find some more reservoirs. But remember again that Pemex didn't want to spend the money to drill any new wells. So we went back to all the old Cantarell wells that had been drilled down to the Cantarell field and looked back up in the younger stratigraphic section to see if we could find any similarities in log response or in age and things like that. So here's a 3D seismic survey was shot. And the discovery well is right here. There's the discovery well. So we looked at some more wells, and we gave them number here, well number 2. Should be a 3 here. No, excuse me. No, well number 4, well number 5, well 6, and well 7. And they formed a cross section where this black line is. Whenever you've got seismic data, you should always use that to try to correlate from area to area. So the question we had then was, can we take this seismic data? Here's your discovery well right here. Well number 1, we'll call it. Here's the well log. Yeah, here's the two well logs, the gamma ray and the resistivity. Resistivity and gamma ray for the discovery well. Now we already know by age dating, we know that Globigerina myoseneca, its last occurrence was in the well, in the discovery well, was 830 meters. Globigerina altispira the last appearance was at 1100 meters. And Globigerina nepenthes, the last appearance was at 1,330 meters. And we also know that the reservoirs were associated with Globigerina altispira and Globigerina nepenthes. So we overlay our seismic, we do a time to depth conversion, or depth to time conversion, and then overlay the well logs onto the seismic at the proper scale, vertical scale, and we can then pinpoint which one of these seismic reflectors corresponds to the Globigerina altispira reservoir, and which one of these reflectors corresponds to the Globigerina nepenthes reservoir. And what we found was that Globigerina nepenthes was this green line. We drew in the green line. And altispira was this green line up in here. Comes across like that. Now notice in your seismic that most of your reflectors are more or less horizontal, except down in this area down here, where you get this steeply dipping reflector, and that's an expression of that fault, that K fault that I talked about. So, if we kind of simplify this now, we know that nepenthes is down here where I have this yellow line, and whoops, and we know that altispira was this yellow line right here. Okay, so now we've pinpointed that on the seismic, and we've been able to identify two seismic reflectors that represent the reservoir. Well, this lower reflector, which I've called here SP3, it's truncated by the fault. Okay? You can't trace that reflector on either side of this K fault, which is also shown in yellow. I guess I'll change the color a little bit. Let's try one. So the nepenthe reflector actually comes across something like this, and it's truncated by the fault, that K fault. The altispira, the other reservoir, reservoir number 2, is truncated by the fault here, but you can trace it laterally a little bit further. So let's simplify that now. Here's the K fault. The lower reservoir, which I call SP3, is truncated by the fault. And the upper reservoir is this yellow line, and you can extend that a little bit further away from the fault. But over on the left side, it's truncated by the fault. Okay, so here's the discovery well again up here. Now we're going to do this well log cross-section based on the seismic. So we're going to do a cross-section now here, following that black line where we have all those wells crossing that line, that black line, artificial line. So well number 2 was located right here. Well number 6, and well number 7, well number 4 was here, and well number 5 was there. So well number 5, we can trace that reflector that represents the upper reservoir. We can trace that all the way across. The lower reservoir we can't because it's truncated by the fault. So here, if you look at this part of that log cross-section, you'll see the lower reservoir truncated by the fault. The fault is shown by that red line. The upper reservoir, though, extends all the way across to well number 4 and to well number, well, almost to well number 5. And here's the reflector right there. Whoops, excuse me, here's the reflector down here. So we say to ourselves, well, okay, if the discovery well had those 2 reservoir sands in it, we now know which seismic reflectors corresponded to those 2 reservoir sands. Now we can go to other wells using the seismic for correlation and try to see if we can detect those same reservoir sands. And so that's what was done. Well number 2, couldn't find, well, let me go back here a second. We go over to well number 2, using a blue line now, and we can't quite get to the reservoir. In other words, the fault is truncated out the sand body somewhere between well 1 and well 2. So here's the log for well 2, the log for well number 1, the reservoir, the upper reservoir, and then the lower reservoir. But we can make an assumption. We can go across the fault to the other side, and at that same seismic interval, we can say, well, that's the upper reservoir is going to be right there, and the lower reservoir will be right there. Okay, we've crossed the fault. And well number 1, we can do the same thing. So now we've got the potential over on the left side of the fault for 4 reservoir sands, 4 prospects, 1 here, 1 there, 1 there, and 1 there. Yeah, I know this is kind of difficult to follow through. Hopefully not too difficult. So over here, we've been able to identify prospects then that are of the same as at the discovery well, well number 1. So a little 3D cartoon shows the wells that we were just correlating. Here's the discovery well. And that fault, here's the fault trace right down here. That's the trace of the fault. So now we've been able to reconstruct the geology, in particular the structure and the stratigraphy on the left side of the fault. Remember I showed you that regional seismic line. First one I showed you showed a little rollover anticline as the where the reservoirs were, and so you see that here. And this is what is shown here is a oil-water contact, or a a gas water contact in this case, being right there. Okay, so now we had accomplished the second part. We had found some horizons from the seismic and the well logs that were potentially gas productive. So we took that back to PMEX, and PMEX said, wow, that's wonderful. Now, can you go on the other side of the fault and find us some reservoirs, some prospects? Well, that's going to be more difficult because now we've got this big fault to cross. They said, well, you're doing such a good job, you can do this too. So I said, okay, we'll give it a try. We're going to raise our consulting rates, though. So that was the next job. How are we going to go from this side of the fault over to this side here to look for more reservoir sand? Well, what we did is we actually went around the fault. The fault kind of died out about in here somewhere. So we took our 3D seismic and we did a loop and came back on the other side of the fault. So the fault came through something like that. So we were now on the other side of the fault. Now here's the part where you guys come in. To give you guys to figure out if there's any reservoir. Here's the discovery well. Okay, here's the discovery well. And the two reservoirs, the Nepenthe is right down there. That's reservoir number 1. Reservoir number 2 is Altaspera. That's the reservoir right there at the discovery well. So, for those of you who have your computers, why don't you spend a few minutes making an interpretation of the seismic line. The first thing you want to do is find that fault. Okay, you want to find the fault that you crossed over, that K fault. Okay, where is it on this loop that we made? Once you've done that, we found a well on the other side of the fault where there was some paleontology, and Nepenthe was right here, and Altaspera was right there. So those are the two reservoirs in the discovery well, and now we see the same intervals on the other side of the fault. So spend a few minutes identifying the fault, and you can see if there's any offset on the fault. Draw the, when you find the reflectors that represent the reservoirs, draw those across like this. So for example, reservoir number 2, the Altaspera, that's going to be this red reflector right there, and you can draw it across to the fault. So do that for, first find the fault, should be pretty easy to find, and then connect up or correlate the two reservoirs from the discovery well with the two reservoirs from, or the two intervals on the other side of the fault. I don't know if that makes sense or not. I hope it does. Okay? So spend a few minutes doing that and see what sort of geology you come up with. The first draw in the fault, and then do the stratigraphy.
Luego, se va hacia aquí, mira, pierde hacia abajo.
Sí.
Ya eso, ¿no? ¿Te parece que está ahí?
¿Está bien? Este, la otra de segundos.
Sí. Hasta el hasta aquí. Y este hasta más abajo es la falla que continuar.
Copy, copy paste. Y le pones esto para editar. Format. Editar format. Ahí te va a dar puntitos. Modificar. Ahí agarra. Tienes que agregar y no.
Echamos el otro.